I came to know the Reverend Carl Scoville, longtime minister to King's Chapel in Boston, through his role as a retreat leader at the Jamaica Plain Unitarian Universalist Church during the mid to late 1990s. I came to know Carl as a person of extraordinary character, honesty, and skill. And because of that, I asked him to serve as my mentor as I entered the preliminary fellowship process with the MFC, the Ministerial Fellowship Committee of the UUA. I was gratified when he agreed, and we met for once a month for about 2.5 years before I left Boston for a position at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Bowling Green, Kentucky. As part of the search process, I had to assemble a packet that included such things as sample sermons, academic transcripts, and a standard form reporting on aspects of my personal history, views, and aptitudes. I also had to come up with a number of letters of recommendation, and of course, I asked Carl to provide me with a letter. Well, he wrote a nice letter and did me the courtesy of showing me the first draft. In the letter, he wrote complimentary things about me and told a bit about my job history as a community minister, a social worker, a high school English teacher, and a cab driver. Cab driver, I said, you really want to include that? I don't think that's such a good idea. It was a time in my life when I was looking for direction, and while it's true that many college graduates go through such a period of their lives, it doesn't usually last 6 years. So we talked about it a little bit. Carl offered no objection to leaving out that part of the story, and that's what he did. Of course, during the telephone interview, the second time I talked with the search committee members from the church, one of the group did ask me about the gap of several years in my resume. So I had to fess up. I've since been thinking, though, about the place that such jobs as cab drivers have in our lives, the jobs that we take to pay the bills, that fund our budgets, and make possible our lifestyles, but don't hold a place in what we think of as our career path. I think it's worthwhile to explore the worth and value of such jobs and examine in what way they contribute to who we become and how we behave in the world. All kinds of people drive cabs in big cities. At least they did when I was driving, which was between the years of 1977 and 1983 or so. There were folks with very little education and folks with PhDs. There were native-born Americans and immigrants of every stripe and variety. There were still a few of the old-timers who wore the steel blue jackets and hats with Hackney badges on them. You might have seen them in the black and white movies. And there were guys who wore cutoffs and tie-dye t-shirts and flip-flops. But if you drove for Boston Cab, you were expected to hold to a certain standard. If you didn't, you were left wondering why, though you were one of the first to show up for the afternoon shift, you were still sitting there an hour later when everyone else was out, as we would say. I don't know how many times or how many nights I drove cab over those 6 years. Over 1,000, I guess. And it was almost always nice. Daytime driving is very different. It was difficult to get a daytime shift because they were reserved for the old-timers, the guys who had made a career out of cab driving. They started early in the morning. They did most of the package delivery and most of the routine work of getting folks to their 9-to-5 jobs or their medical appointments. Oftentimes, they supported a family with their cab driving salaries. Sometimes they were able to send their kids to college on their earnings. They were mostly family men, or retirees, or bachelors, or widowers who had led stable lives. And when I drove, the drivers were almost always men. I remember when the first woman driver, at least on the evening shift, Shelley, came to Boston Cab. The guys did not quite know how to approach her. Most cleaned up their language and adjusted the volume of their conversation. Some expected her to be one of the guys and adopted an attitude that reflected that. She did a good job of finding her way, as I remember. I would have 20 or 30 or 35 fares in a night, sometimes in the 40s. Who knows how many rides that worked out to, over 1,000 nights. Most were routine, but still, there were plenty of adventures. Written on the wall of one of the bathroom stalls was a bit of graffiti, I remember, that originally had said, "Driving a cab is an adventure," in capital letters. Another driver, though, had changed the N in the indefinite article to an M, so that it read, "Driving a cab is am adventure." We always had a few philosophy majors driving cabs, and this, I took it, was a comment on metaphysics. Driving a cab was an adventure on finding out who you were and who you are in the world. I like that idea, and still do. It's from that perspective I share these stories today. Who takes a cab in a city like Boston? Two classes of people mostly. Folks who have plenty of cash and don't mind dropping a few dollars for a ride across town because it's quicker and more pleasant than public transportation. And young to middle-aged folks who are bar hopping at night, groups out for a night of dancing, dining, and drinking who adopt a devil-may-care attitude. Folks who'd rather drop a few dollars for a 3-block ride than take a brisk walk. And then there were the folks with very little money who cannot afford a car, and so they take cabs to do their shopping or to go to neighborhoods not well served by public transport. Folks who work the graveyard shift at blue-collar jobs when the subway has shut down for the night. Who drives a cab at night? At Boston Cab in those days, a good number of us were college grads with little ambition. Nothing that had a career track attracted us. We wanted lives that valued experience over security or possessions or an established place in the world. Cab driving was a means to an end. We were not employed by the cab company. We signed a daily lease agreement. We paid a nominal sum for the cab and a pretty hefty per mile charge, made up the rest of the rental cost. We arrived for work at 4 o'clock or so in the afternoon and sat chatting in the waiting room for the day shift drivers to return their cabs. The rental was for 12 hours, and some guys would hold on to that cab till the last minute. I could rarely manage more than 10 hours myself. You get worn out just sitting all night. And if you have a bad back, as I did, even then, it could get pretty uncomfortable. Kind of like the caged bird that wants to escape the small cabin. By 5 o'clock, though, we were usually on the road, driving into Boston rush hour traffic and the adventure of impatience, dangerous driving habits, gridlock at intersections, exhaust fumes, and frayed nerves. Cab drivers were bothered by little of it. As long as you have a fare, you're getting paid. Whether the traffic is moving or not, the meter is running. But of course, if you do find yourself in a gridlocked traffic pattern, your passenger might just decide it would be quicker to walk the 10 blocks and get out then and there. Then what? No fare, nowhere to go, the minutes running by, and your night off to a bad start. It probably took more than a year to learn patience. The old-timers had all learned patience. You learn that impatience doesn't pay. It just gets the gastric juices going and the heartburn and the headaches follow. Lesson 1, accept the rhythm of the night. You'll make your nut, and after that, every dollar is yours. It would take about 5 hours to make your nut, the money that you were going to hand over in the zippered pouch, along with your way bill at the end of the night. For the next 3 hours, you'd put together a little money, then wait for the bar runs at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the morning, as the bars with various license limitations closed up and the late night crowd needed to get home. Then you might stick around for the late night fares. Very few, but sometimes lucrative. Lesson 2 was the same as lesson 1. Be patient. High among the myths of cab driving is that it's a dangerous profession, and there is some truth to that. I saw somewhere recently that a cab driver's chance of getting killed on the job are about 7 times that of the average worker, and I guess that's probably about right. You are, after all, amidst the general public all of the time, and that's not a very select group. And you are obligated by law to pick up anyone who flags you and to take them anywhere they want to go. Somewhere along the line, and the earlier the better, you had better learn to amend that rule for the sake of your own survival. Every cab was equipped with a plexiglass partition with a plexiglass cup in which the customer could place his or her payment for a ride and where the driver could put the change. I learned to close that shield after every departing passenger. 29 times out of 30, as a passenger entered the cab, I would slide open the partition. Once a night, probably, I would leave the partition in place. I'd rather not take the risk, thank you. Lesson 3, be safe, be prudent, protect yourself. If your customer wanted to go to a public housing project, he would not say that, of course. He would give you a street address. Generally, that was enough to let you know if you knew the city. Otherwise, he'd give you directions without mentioning a destination. Once at the project, which is how we refer to public housing, you were legally obligated to drive the customer to the door. If you did that, you were pretty much a fool. When you got to the entrance of the project, you would say, sorry, this is as far as I can go. Even that was pushing it. If you were wise, you'd size up your fare along the way and inform him that you'd be leaving him off at the edge of the project. If he contested that then, you'd save yourself the trouble of an argument by dropping him off then and there. You had to learn street smarts. Lesson 4, street smarts. A corollary of lesson 3, be safe, be prudent. I may have had 30 or 35,000 fares in my career as a cab driver. I was fortunate enough never to look down the barrel of a gun or to have a knife pulled on me. Other guys were not so fortunate, of course. When you heard the story of an armed robbery, and they were not that frequent, you would wonder if the driver had done all the things he needed to do to stay safe. Sometimes there was nothing you could do. The partitions were made of bulletproof glass, we were told, but no one knew what caliber of bullet they were designed to stop. My brother drove cab during the same time I did. He started a year earlier, in fact, and he drove for even longer. He was one of the drivers with a master's degree in philosophy. He tells the story of taking his fare to his destination on a fairly busy street, I remember. When the fare told him he would pay at the driver's window, my brother was suspicious enough to put his car in drive as the man got out, keeping his foot on the brake. His other foot. The man must have counted his money 3 times as he was trying to sort out the cost of the fare. Midway through the 3rd count, John caught sight of the weapon. I don't remember now if it was a knife or a gun. He hit the gas and sped off into the night. No fare for that ride, but life and limb were intact. Sometimes you get a warning of danger, sometimes there is no warning. One summer afternoon, early in my shift, I picked up 2 women near the Brigham Circle area. This is the edge of the hospital district, which then held the Peter Ben Brigham, the New England Deaconess, Beth Israel Hospital, Children's Hospital, the Dana-Farber Cancer Center, and Harvard Medical School, all gathered together across several blocks on one side of the street. Across the street is Mission Hill, a blue-collar, long-time working-class district, which was beginning then to be mixed racially. The 2 young women were black and wanted to go to Mattapan, a predominantly black neighborhood. To get there, you had to go through Roxbury, also mostly black, and the scene of some racial turmoil during the 60s. I turned up Parker Street as a reasonable way to avoid the predictable traffic tie-ups on Huntington Ave and Tremont Street. I was confronted almost immediately with what was clearly some version of a race riot. Both sides of the street were lined with black folks. Most were either teenagers or in their 20s, but all ages were represented, and both sexes. There were kids, and there were elderly matrons. At least half a dozen interspersed throughout the crowd held stones, large stones, cobble size, in their hands. And those hands were in a throwing posture. There was nothing to do but drive through. I warned my passengers to duck, and I leaned across the street, the seat, so I couldn't see the road anymore, and I hit the accelerator. I tried covering my head while driving straight ahead. It was an impossible situation. A rock came through the back window. My passengers screamed. A rock came through the front seat passenger window and hit me on the crown of the head. I lost control of the car. When I looked up, I saw that we were against the curb, tire to curb. I hit the gas pedal, but nothing happened. Just a loud whirring sound. I'll never forget the looks on the faces of those holding the rocks. My eyes looked into their eyes. They held the rocks and had to decide whether or not to throw them. When you are looking right into the eyes of someone, it's difficult for them to attack you. It's difficult to deny your humanity and hold on to a stereotype that you are a racist or a honky or an enemy across racial lines. But you can't look 6 people in the eyes at once, especially when some are on the opposite side of the street. And when you look away, the spell is broken, and the attacker then faces another pressure, not to back down in the face of the other attackers. And so the rocks flew. It took me a few seconds to realize that the car had slipped out of gear. Once I got it into drive, I was off. The passengers continued to scream. I put my hand to my scalp and felt blood. My hand was a sticky red mess. I wiped it on my pants and headed for City Hospital. Despite the fact that we were just a few blocks from the hospital district, my family had grown up in Dorchester, and we used City as our hospital, the hospital for poorer folks. When I got there, my farers began to argue with me. They said I needed to take them to Mattapan. I explained that they were going to have to find another cab as I was going to need medical treatment. They were not pleased. I still can't understand their inability to see that I was in no shape to bring them to their destination. I waited in the hospital emergency room for an hour without being seen. Periodically, I went to the water fountain to wash off the blood. In the end, the bleeding stopped, and I just left. The cab was still sitting in the drive. I took it back to the cab lot, cashed out for the night, and went home. The next morning, the newspaper covered the story. 6 people ended up going to City Hospital to have their injuries treated. The paper reported that one patient, unidentified, left the hospital before receiving treatment. My brother and I exchanged smiles and knowing remarks at the breakfast table as my mother wondered what we were talking about. What is the lesson here? I don't know what incident prompted this group of folks to line up on the street with stones in hand and violence in mind, but I don't expect to understand the reasons for everything that happens in a big city. You need to be ready for anything. I never did overlearn the lesson and held to overgeneralized prejudicial thoughts about black folks. And I never could understand how they could see me as an enemy when, after all, I was in the process of giving a ride to black folks through a black district to another black district. Rage is blind, and whatever propelled that impulse to violence, it was rage-filled. Lesson 5, be prepared for anything. Most nights were not so eventful, of course, and some things we did in those days no one does anymore. Every night some of us would get a call to pick up films from Fenway Park or Boston Garden or one of the universities, to drive to one of the local TV stations in town, game films from sports contests that someone at the studio would have to cut for highlights for the evening news. Nowadays, of course, all that is done electronically and almost immediately. Lesson 6, nothing lasts forever. I'll never forget the night I was attacked by people throwing stones while I was driving on Parker Street because of my level of fear. Another fear I won't forget is prompted not by memories of fear, but of shame. It was early in the evening. I had picked up a young couple from the suburbs on a trip to the city to take in some of the nightlife. I dropped them off at Quincy Market, the busiest of Boston's tourist areas. The man handed me a $20 bill for a fare of $4 or $5. I gave him change for a 10. I purposely shortchanged him for reasons I've never fully understood. I remember thinking, this is what the guys do. I remember thinking how nice it would be to save an hour's work later in the evening because I had that extra 10 spot in my pocket already. The woman got out of the car. The man did too, counting his change before shouting, "Hey, you shortchanged me. I gave you a 20 and you gave me change for a 10. His wife said nothing. He was furious. I gave him the 10 that I owed him. He glared at me and made some remark, if not cursing me, at least wishing I'd get my just reward for being a thief and a jerk. I gave him a blank stare, but I held to the lesson that shame had taught me. They were in town for the night to enjoy themselves, get out, do something different, and I had ruined their night, or at least the beginning of the night, by my antics. I was in my mid-20s. I knew what was right and wrong. This kind of testing of limits is something you do as a teenager, learning through experience what to do and what not to do. The only rationale that I can come up with is that I did not test the rules when I was an adolescent. I was a good boy who did not drink in high school or try pot or other drugs, did not lie or steal or cheat, at least to any significant degree. So I learned to be honest in my transactions with customers because the feeling of shame was so uncomfortable. Lesson 6, uncomfortable emotions can be heuristic. They can lead you to more responsible behavior. I was good-hearted more often than I was greedy, though, and I paid for that as well. One cold night, as I was driving back into the city along Mass Ave, returning from a fair to Dorchester, an old woman with a big green trash bag filled up with what looked like clothes waved me down. Clearly, she was a bag lady, old, dirty, disheveled. But I felt bad for her on this cold night, and she was going my way, so I thought I'd help her out with a ride. Her eyes were rheumy, and her diction was not clear. Her teeth were broken, and the ones remaining were brown. She said she wanted to go to Edward Everett Square. That was in the opposite direction. I had no desire to drive back to Everett Square. I wanted to get on with my night. But I determined to take her, so I took the turn at Albany Street and drove back into Dorchester. We got to Edward Everett Square, but then she said she wanted to go to Dorchester Ave. And then it was Upham's Corner. Well, she was mentally ill, of course, and had no destination in mind except perhaps to get out of the cold. I let her out at Everett Square and turned back to the city. But what a stench. It was one of the worst smells I'd ever come across, and it was in the enclosed space of a cab, and it would not go away. Every passenger for the rest of the night complained about it and opened the windows, letting in the frosty air. They shivered and cursed and left without tipping or leaving much of a tip, and told their friends, no doubt, that the cabs in Boston are allowed to stink, and nobody does anything about it. Lesson 7, it doesn't pay to be too soft-hearted. Learn to balance charity with the imperative for self-interest. Practice good judgment. Can you have a spiritual experience driving a cab? You can have a spiritual experience anywhere, I guess. For me, the progress of a winter snowstorm provided a spiritual experience. If you get your cab out on the road at 4 o'clock or so in the afternoon, you'd catch just the last bit of daylight on a winter day in Boston. Just then, the snow begins to fall, and it falls for 10 hours. Some folks have been sent home early from their offices because of the threat of a storm, so the streets, while busy, are not maddeningly so. Most folks are in a good mood, an edge of excitement prompted by the change in scenery and routine that comes along with a big snowfall. Most everyone wants to get to a warm and safe house. The younger folks want to be out and about, of course. There's adventure ahead, and the snow adds a dimension of novelty to the frivolity. Hour by hour, the snow accumulates. A kind of dry slush forms on the street, and the vehicles churn up the snow and pack it down. The traffic gets lighter till it's mostly just cabs on the road, and police cars, and buses, and a few commercial vehicles. And after a while, even that dies down. Most of the drivers put up, which is our lingo for returning the cabs to the garage and retiring for the night. The sidewalks have 10 inches of snow on them by now, or 12, or 15. Every time you come to an intersection, you hit the brakes, early and gently, sliding into your stop with just the hint of a fishtail. You look up at the street lights as the snow comes down, smaller flakes now and light, but beautiful against the yellow glow of the lamps. And the public garden and Boston Common are covered in snow. Every tree looks like a feature of Wonderland, and you feel at peace in the world. Lesson 8, driving a cab can be a spiritual experience. Cab driving funded my lifestyle for half a dozen years and allowed me to save enough money to fund the first 6 months of the 9-month trip I took to Europe in 1980 and 81, but those are stories for another time. There are always lessons to be learned in the work that we do, and we've got to decide for ourselves their value in the development of our lives. If you remember the movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, you might remember Sarah, Hannah, and Leah Piezol singing, "In the highways, in the hedges, I'll be somewhere working for my Lord." I don't quite know what they mean by their Lord, but for me, working for my Lord means working for those values I hold most worthy, hold most high, the lessons we learn in the world, doing the ordinary work of the world, the kind of work we all do in one way or another every day.